Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over a famous game from the 1985 World Championships between Kasparov and Karpov, two of the greatest chess minds of all time, and probably one of the greatest chess rivalries that we've seen in a very long time. Karpov is going to be playing the white pieces, and Kasparov is going to be playing the black pieces. Starts out with pawn to e4, pawn c5. Kasparov deciding to play the Sicilian Offense, a very aggressive defense, can lead to not only a draw, but a lot of times has a very high win percentage for black. If you look at kind of all the defenses, this has a very good win percentage for black. So really tough to see right now if Kasparov is going to play for a draw or to play for the win, but Sicilian definitely gives him a lot of different chances. White continues here with knight to f3, and Kasparov plays pawn to e6. Now he does have other options here. A lot of times from here you may see pawn to d6, kind of going into the dragon, if you're familiar with that variation of the Sicilian, or the Nassdorf, which you'll see a lot of different times. But Kasparov decided instead to play pawn to e6. From here, white continues up the board, pushing forward with pawn to d4. Very common in the Sicilian to go ahead and attack this pawn on c5 and kind of challenge the center to kind of see what black's going to do here. Kasparov decides to go ahead and take, and after the knight recaptures here on d4, then Kasparov now will develop his own knight to c6. Now, a lot of time lower rated chess players will jump at any opportunity to exchange pieces. In this case, the knight takes on c6. But a lot of times higher level chess players usually try to develop their pieces methodically and then try to formulate a game plan and then kind of base their moves based on that game plan. Really don't want to try to exchange pieces early on. That's exactly what Karpov decides to do in this case. And he actually plays knight to b5 here. He's really eyeing down this d6 square. It doesn't really matter where Kasparov plays right here. Let's say he brings his knight to f6. Karpov can now bring his knight to d6, and after the exchange here, because obviously the king is in check, this is going to be pretty hard for Kasparov to play against, simply because his light square bishop here, it's going to be very difficult for him to get this out. Obviously, black cannot castle on the king side because the queen's here. It's just kind of a thorn in Kasparov's side. Not necessarily to say that black doesn't have a possible good game here, but needless to say is Kasparov doesn't really want to get into this situation. So with that said, because Karpov did play knight to b5, Kasparov decided to play pawn to d6. Now this does a couple things. Obviously this pretty much thwarts all of Karpov's ideas of bringing his knight to d6, but at the same time it allows him later on to play a6 and kind of push this knight off of the b5 square. Really the only square for this knight to go once he's kicked off is c3 and a3. Now keep in mind he's not really going to come to c3 because then he's blocking his own knight in, so he's really going to end up on a3. Now if we look at it like that, you never really want to have your knight on the rim, either the a or the h file. So because of this d6 move that's pretty obvious to Garry Kasparov, I really don't like this move from Karpov, from knight to b5, but that's kind of what Karpov was thinking, is eyeing down on this d6 square. From here, Kasparov now played pawn to c4, trying to get kind of a spatial advantage here. Kasparov has really allowed white to dominate the center of the board, playing d6 and not pushing his pawn up further. So white's trying to take advantage of that. So he's starting to put some pressure on the center of the board. As you can see, he has a lot of pressure on this d5 square right here, with both of his pawns and his queen kind of lined up on this d5 square. From here, Kasparov plays knight to f6. Again, top level play, you always want to start to develop your pieces. Kasparov does exactly that. Brings knight to f6, makes way for his king to castle on the king side. Obviously he just has to move his bishop, and also adding pressure on this pawn right here on e4. Now from here, white plays knight to c3. Again, simple development move. At the same time, He's also defending this pawn on e4 that's now being attacked from Kasparov. Kasparov now decides to go ahead and kick this knight off. He's going to have to kick it off sometime, so he decides to go ahead and play pawn to a6. And as we talked about before, the knight is now going to have to come back to a3. Not really the best position for this knight. Can't really move anywhere right now. Can't come back to b5. He'll lose. Or if he brings it to c4, obviously there's a pawn here right now. So White right now has a good spatial advantage in the center of the board with his pawns here on c4 and e4, but his knight here on a3 is kind of a pain. He's going to have to do something about that later on. Now from here, Kasparov has two different options. The most likely that you'll see a lot of times is bishop to e7. Again, just simple development move, getting his pieces involved in the game, getting ready to castle on the king side. The bishop may come to e2, and then both sides may castle. This is typical. Kasparov does not play typical. Usually he studies openings that a lot of us have really never thought about before, and that's exactly what he plays here. He plays pawn to d5, which is actually, if you kind of look at all the different variations of how you can play it, Kasparov opts to play this as a gambit. So he's actually going to give up a pawn so that he can have rapid development and a very good line for attacking White's king side. So from here, Karpov takes on d5, and after the exchanges here on d5, White again retakes on d5, and now the knight comes to b4. Now you can already see that this knight has come past the 5th rank, which is the 4th rank for White, but there's a lot more attacking lines here. Black already has a knight here on f6 getting into the game. There's no way for White really to kick this knight off, as before we saw the pawn could come to a6. Well, the pawn cannot come to a3 here from White. So as you can already see, this is a little bit different as far as Kasparov bringing his knight past the 5th rank as it was from Karpov bringing his knight past the 4th rank. To give everyone a little bit of context on the next move, this actual position had been reached before, and White played bishop to c4, trying to protect this pawn here on d5. Again, White is up a pawn in material, so a lot of times if you're up in material, you want to hold on to that advantage. But from here, Black decided to bring his bishop to g4 in the previous game, and this led to a draw. So Karpov actually found a much better improvement from his bishop here on c4, and instead of bringing his bishop to c4, he now brought his bishop to e2, which is a vast improvement, because in the game before, after his bishop came to c4, the bishop came down to g4, then the bishop came back to e2. So you can see there is kind of a wasted move from White. So Karpov saw this in his earlier game and decided, instead of playing to c4, I'm going to go ahead and play my bishop to e2. So that's kind of the context that we see this bishop to e2. Now from here, Black decided, again, you always want to develop your pieces as fast as you can, and in this case you want to develop them towards the center for center control. This is a great square from Black. Obviously he wants to get his dark square bishop into the game so he can castle as soon as he can. So this is a great square, bishop to c5, putting a lot of pressure on the king side, at the same time getting ready to castle. From here we see both sides to go ahead and castle. White castles and Black castles as well. And now White now brings his bishop to f3. Now again, we're no longer worried about the bishop coming down to g4, because now it could just be taken if he wanted to. At the same time, White does still want to try to hold on to this advantage that he has on d5. Black kind of has a spatial advantage as far as his minor pieces kind of moved up the board. So White does have a small advantage in his pawn on d5, so he kind of wants to hold on to that. So bringing his bishop to f3 is a great way to do both of those things. From here, Black is going to bring his bishop to f5, again getting his last minor piece developed into the game, and at the same time really dominating the center of the board. We have this bishop here on c5 and this bishop here on f5, kind of dominating the d4 and the e4 square. Anytime you develop your pieces, you really want to control the center of the board. That's why we bring our knights to c6 and f6, because they really control the center of the board. So these are great development moves from Black as he continues his development. From here, White's going to bring his bishop to g5. As most people do, they like to bring their bishop pinning down pieces to other pieces. From here, as you can see, the knight is pinned down to the queen on d8, so this knight's not going to be able to move for some time. Now from here, the Rook is going to come to e8. Again, rooks belong on semi-open files or open files. Kasparov already has all his minor pieces developed, and so now you want to get your major pieces involved in the game. It's not the other way around. You don't want to start getting your rooks before your minor pieces are developed. So his minor pieces are developed. He now brings his rook to e8. Fantastic move, getting it involved on this e file. From here, white decides to bring his queen to d2, again adding a little pressure, defense on this bishop on g5, and at the same time, he really wants to connect his rooks. Anytime you can develop all your minor pieces, get your queen in the game, and connect your rooks, that's a good thing. So that's a great starting thing for Karpov. And now both sides kind of decide on how the rest of the game is going to go forward. So Kasparov looked at the game and he kind of saw all his minor pieces are developed. Now what should he really do? So a lot of times, even without thinking of what's good for you, think about what's bad for your opponent. And what Kasparov saw here is the one weakness that white really has is his knight here on a3, as we talked about. All his other pieces are completely fine. They're controlling the center, they're well developed, but this knight here on a3 is kind of a problem. And the really only move that this can make is knight to c4. Obviously he can start to come back, but you never really want to bring your pieces back, just waiting in defense for your opponent to attack. So in this case, Kasparov decided that pawn to b5 is a fantastic move. It kind of locks in this knight here on a3. Anytime you can lock your opponent's pieces from getting involved in the game, that's a good move. So that's exactly what Kasparov does with that move, pawn to b5. Now from here, the rook is going to come to d1. Again, this is a semi-open file, and rooks belong behind your own pawns, especially on a semi-open file, so he can really start to push this pawn up the board if he wants to. Now from here, Kasparov plays a great move, and this kind of sets the tone for the rest of the game, and it's knight to d3. Again, he does have pressure. Obviously, white's not going to take with his queen here because it's being defended by this bishop here, but this really is going to be a thorn in white's side the rest of the game. It's going to be really hard for white to kick this knight off anytime soon. As you can see, his knights aren't going to get there anytime soon, and his bishop is going to have to lose a lot of tempos to try to kick this knight off. So white's really going to have to worry about this knight for the rest of the game, which is why it's a fantastic move for black. Now from here, Karpov obviously realized that his knight here on a3 was a problem, so he decides to bring his knight to b1. He needs to get it in a better square, so this is the first move that he has to make, knight to b1. Now from here, Kasparov plays h6, trying to trade off his knight here for this bishop on g5. Now keep in mind, this is an open game. Anytime it's an open game, bishops tend to fare a little better, especially at grandmaster play. Most players prefer bishops. So in this place, Karpov is not going to exchange. Now I do feel like his move probably wasn't that great. He actually probably should have exchanged, just because Kasparov's putting a lot of pressure on the center of the board, and so anytime pressure is being put on you, anytime you can exchange pieces, kind of alleviate some of the pressure, I think it's a good thing. Karpov decided there wasn't too much pressure that he should be worried about, so he decided to decline and bring his bishop back to h4. Now from here, black just continued relentlessly up the board, started putting even more and more pressure on white here, playing pawn to b4, attacking the knight here on c3, and trying to force white to really make a mistake and get all his pieces out of whack here. Again, this knight here is nicely placed on c3, defending and attacking the center of the board, so he's kind of testing that to see where this knight's going to go. The knight now comes to a4. Now as you can see here, white now has a knight here on b1 and a4. That's not really what you want your knights to be doing in a game, being on the very bottom or on the side of the board. They can't really do much. So from here, obviously as you can see, the knight was attacking the bishop here on c5. Kasparov does not really want to get rid of one of his most valuable pieces, his bishop there on c5, so he decides to bring it back to a central square. He does not want to exchange right away, and so he brings it back to d6. A nice central square for his bishop, at the same time avoiding the exchange. Now from here, white plays bishop to g3. Now keep in mind, this dark square bishop for white right now is not doing anything, but this dark square bishop for black is doing a whole lot. It's very central, and it's very, very active. So anytime your opponent has a piece that's active and you have one that's not, it's really a good idea to exchange those pieces off the board, because it's just good for you. So in this case, Karpov sees this. He now brings his bishop back to g3, so he decides that he wants to go ahead and exchange these pieces off the board. So from here, black decides he doesn't need to worry about that right away. He does have his queen protecting it, so he brings his rook to c8. Again, you want your rooks on open files or semi-open files, and that's exactly what black does. Now Karpov now brings his pawn to b3. Again, he now has a knight on a4. He has to do something about it. He can't bring it to b6 because of the queen. He can't bring it to c3 here because of the pawn. So he really needs to bring it back to b2 so that he can get it to, let's say, c4 and start getting involved in the game. The only way he can do that is if he brings his pawn to c3. Now Kasparov starts to really expand on the king side, and he plays pawn to g5. Now this does a few things, and it really locks down the dark squares on the king side, but at the same time, this knight here on f6 can now get involved in the game. Before, as we talked about, this knight here on f6 was kind of pinned down. So anytime that one of your pieces that's been pinned down is no longer pinned down, try to see where you can actively get that piece involved in the game. So this knight here on f6 is really going to be a huge part of Kasparov's plan going forward. Now here, white decided to go ahead and exchange off pieces, exactly what we talked about before. His dark square bishop's not doing much. Exchange it for a bishop that is doing a lot into the game. The queen obviously has to take on d6, and now white plays pawn to g3, really allowing this bishop, if he needs to really kind of have an escape square. This is kind of a huge key defender for white, so he's really trying to have an escape square if he needs it to kind of fall back. Now from here, black plays knight to d7. Again, as we talked about, Kasparov can now get his knight involved in the game. Can't really do it now, but if he brings it to d7, he can then nicely place it on e5. This is a much stronger place than it was here on f6. f6 is kind of controlling the center of the board, but Kasparov is ready to attack. So if he brings it to e5, this is putting a lot of pressure on white. So from here, white's going to play bishop back to g2, as we talked about, trying to get a little safety. Really trying to protect his king side because he realizes there's starting to be a lot of pressure on the king side from Kasparov. Now black decides to bring his queen back to f6 for two reasons. One, to kind of control this long diagonal. Obviously you want your bishops and queens to control as much space as possible. That's why they're better in open games. And at the same time, as we'll see, he's kind of eyeing down on this f file. Once this bishop comes off the board, he's really eyeing down on this f2 pawn. Now from here, white's going to play pawn to a3. This is kind of a thorn in his side, this pawn here on b4. And so Kasparov just plays a5 so that he can just exchange, and he still has a pawn here on b4. Now white's going to bring his queen to a2, and now the bishop is going to come back to g6. Again, he's still putting a lot of pressure with his light square bishop on the middle, but again, he does really want his dark square bishop, or excuse me, his dark square queen here to really control this long dark diagonal, at the same time to put pressure on this f2 square. Now the next move, from a lot of people's opinion, is probably the worst move that Karpov played in the game. He still has a lot of fighting chances. He's still up in material, so it's not like the game is lost by Karpov by any means. He still has great kingside safety. Everything is okay. The one good thing he does have, he is up in material. His next move is really kind of a question mark from a lot of people, and that's pawn to d6. It really doesn't do a lot. I guess he thought that Kasparov would take the pawn on d6, kind of lose a tempo, so white can kind of get back in the game. He probably could have played, bishop to h1 if he kind of wants a waiting move, or even pawn to h3 so Kasparov can't kind of push up the board anymore. Or he could have even played king to h1 as kind of a waiting move and getting his king off of this f2 as far as if there's an attack on the f2 square. But again, he decided not to, and instead he played pawn to d6. Now Kasparov is up in, as far as his development and his attack, there's no way he's going to waste a move on a mere pawn on d6. He's not trying to capture a pawn on d6. He's trying to capture this king here on g1. So Kasparov plays pawn to g4, just again putting a lot of more pressure on the white king side here. From here, white's going to come back to d2, trying to centralize and at the same time protect as many squares as he can on the board. And now the black king comes to g7. As you can see, this bishop here on d2, it's attacking many of the squares, one of those being this pawn here on h6. So black has to centralize his king a little bit and protect this pawn here on h6. Now the pawn from here comes to f3 from Karpov. I kind of think this is a mistake. Anytime you fianchetto your bishop to the king side, anytime you start to move your other pawns, it significantly weakens your king side. In this case, as you can see, this long diagonal, this dark diagonal attacking the king, it's going to be a huge weakness, and we'll see Kasparov kind of exploit that later on into the game. Now from here, Kasparov now decides to go ahead and take the pawn here on d6. So now both sides are even in material, but as you can see, it's going to be really hard for white to attack this king here on g7, but black has a lot of opportunities to attack this white king, especially now that this pawn came to f3. It's kind of opened the door for Kasparov to attack. From here, white decided to go ahead and take here on g4. Yes, he does go up in material, but at the same time, you can kind of see the door opening for Kasparov. Now, Kasparov does bring his queen to d4. Anytime a door opens, especially if your name's Kasparov, you attack, you open that door, and you crush your opponent. And that's exactly what he does in this game. Karpov here brings his king back to h1, and now Kasparov brings his knight to f6. Obviously, before, as we talked about, he could bring it to e5, but now he wants to even push farther, so he brings it to f6, so that he can now take on g4 if he wants to, or he can even bring it to e4 if he wants to. Now from here, Karpov decided to kind of challenge the center. Obviously, you never want your opponent to have their queen kind of in your base, kind of running things. So Karpov decides to play rook to f4. And this is kind of a deciding move in the game from Kasparov, because he plays a fantastic move that really challenges everything Karpov is trying to do as far as protecting his house. So if you want to go ahead and pause and see if you can find Kasparov's best move, we'll kind of go forward from there. Hopefully you found knight to e5. Kind of as we talked about before, it's a fantastic move, and really it's hard for Karpov not to lose this exchange. Karpov decides to take the knight there on d3, and now the knight can come to f2, attacking the king, and at the same time forking this queen here on d3. There's no real other option except to take, and now the bishop can come into d3 and capture the queen. So this was obviously a good exchange for Kasparov, and he still has a lot of pressure on the board with his rooks just getting ready to come into the game. Now the rook's going to come to d2, trying to put some pressure on this d file. But from here, the queen's just going to come down to e3. Fantastic move. There's not a whole lot white can do here. We'll go ahead and finish it out, though. He now captures the bishop there on d3. And now a fantastic move. Kasparov brings his rook down to c1. From here, the game's kind of over. Karpov can actually kind of resign from here. There's not much he can do. He does play it out, but if you kind of analyze, this move is so phenomenal as far as what was Kasparov's plan actually in the game. His plan was rook to c1. Fantastic move. From here, obviously, he can't take with his rook. He'll lose even faster, so he does decide to bring his knight to b2 to add a little bit more protection on his rook on d1. And now the queen comes to f2. As you can start to see, he's starting to put more and more pressure onto the king side again. The rook still can't come to c1 because then the rook would come down to e1, and it's going to be quicker, a lot faster. But from here, the knight does come to d2, trying to come to the aid of the protection of his king. And from here, rook captures on d1. Now, if you look in the game, he actually could have brought his rook down to e2. Probably could have checkmated a little faster, but, tomato, doesn't really matter. He instead took on d1, and after the knight came down to d1 to recapture, then the rook came to e1, and it's a good game. Karpov decided to resign in this case. As you can see, there's really nothing they can do. It's going to be a good game from here. So, fantastic game from Kasparov. As you can see, he just relentlessly attacked Karpov, and he saw a small little disadvantage from white, and he attacked it early, and then he realized that he could just completely annihilate the king side from white. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.